5 English grammar rules you must learn before you die, or after, by LetThemTalkTV. Brilliant, brilliant. Another video written. In versus to versus at, position, movement and vicinity. Now this is a very common mistake I hear among learners of English, and that is the difference between prepositions of movement and prepositions of position. For example, I often hear something like, I went in Italy last weekend. Not correct. I was to London yesterday. Not correct. Here is why. To is a preposition of movement, so you'll often use it with verbs that indicate movement, such as go or come. I went to Italy last week. I came back to France yesterday. In is usually a preposition of position, so you use it with the verb to be. I was in Italy last month. I've been studying in France for the last 6 weeks. Now, 2 points to bear in mind. In can mean inside or into. So in this case, it represents movement when it's into. Look at this sentence. She walked in the room. It's ambiguous, isn't it? Did she come from another place and enter the room? Or was she already in the room and walking around it? As I said, in is usually used for position, but sometimes we use in when what we really mean is inside or into. She walked inside the room. That's clear. She was in the room walking around it. She walked into the room. She came from elsewhere. So sometimes in English we shorten inside and into to in. This is perfectly okay and correct. Just don't do it if it can lead to some misunderstanding. So sometimes if you want to be completely clear, say she came into the room, or she entered the room, or she walked inside the room. Now, question for you. What's the difference between these two sentences? He's at the station. He's in the station. Let me explain. At means in the vicinity of, but not necessarily inside. Let's meet at the station in front of the entrance, outside. Okay? In means geographically inside. Let's meet in the station at the ticket office. So you can use at to mean inside or outside, but in only means inside. I'll be at home this afternoon in the garden, which is outside, of course. I left my suitcases in my house. Been to versus been in versus gone to. Now this is very much linked to the last point, but I thought I should explain it separately because it's such a common mistake. So look at these two sentences. I've been to Chicago. I've been in Chicago. What's the difference? Now, as I said earlier, to is about movement. So being to Chicago means that you have made a visit or a trip to Chicago at least once in your life. That's why the correct question to this answer would be, have you ever been to Chicago, not in Chicago? In is about position, as I said earlier. So if you're staying or living somewhere or studying somewhere, you would use been in. I've been in Chicago for 6 months. Use been in to talk about where you are currently at. Now, let's look at the question, how long have you been in Chicago? So with how long questions, use the preposition in. Okay, so when do we use gone to? Now, been to means that you have travelled to a place, but then travelled away. I've been to Moscow twice this year. Gone to means that you have travelled to a place and you are still there. Where is Hillary? She's gone to Dublin. She's coming back next week. Okay. Obligation, must, have to, and have got to. So, in the affirmative, what's the difference between must and have to and have got to? Now, all of them are forms of obligation. Do they have a similar meaning? Yes, they do. Is there a difference? Well, there is a nuance of difference between must and the other two, have to and have got to. Must is about an internal obligation, and have to and have got to refer to an external obligation. Let me give you an examples and it'll become clearer. I must go to the dentist this week. Okay, so the speaker believes it's necessary for him. I have to finish this report by 5 p.m. Right, there is an external obligation on the speaker. Let's look at another example. I must eat more vegetables. Good for my health. Okay, an internal obligation. I've got to clean the dishes or my girlfriend will be very angry with me. Okay, that's an external obligation. Now in questions 2, you might see this distinction. Must you make that noise? Must you leave now? Can't you stay a little longer? I've got to go because I have an appointment. Okay. Have got to and must are just used in the present tense. In the past tense and future tense, use will have to or had to in the past tense. I had to go to the dentist yesterday. You can't use must then. Now, this is a nuance. If you say, do you have to make that noise? Or I must clean the dishes. It's okay. It's perfectly okay. You will be understood. However, when we're looking at the negatives between mustn't and don't have to, there is a big difference. Okay, a mustn't is a negative obligation. You mustn't talk in the library. You mustn't smoke in here. Don't have to means no obligation. It's okay if you do it, but you don't have to. I don't have to work tomorrow. As I said, no obligation, but you can if you want. I don't have to read this book, but I like it. When you should use whom in spoken English. Now, a common question I get as an English teacher is, what is the difference between who and whom? And my answer is that while I'm happy to explain it, most of the time, it's not important. You can carry on with your daily life without knowing the difference. Walk down the street, buy bananas, play tennis, order a pizza, and live your life happily without whom. However, there is one case where whom is still frequently used in spoken English. Okay, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Before I do that, let me briefly explain the difference for those who really want to know. Okay, so who is used to talk about the subject of a sentence. Who are you calling? Is that right? No, it should be whom. Whom are you calling? Because if you answer the question, who are you calling? The answer is, I'm calling him, or I'm calling her, or I'm calling them, which are object pronouns. So it must be whom. But do we say that in conversation? Whom are you calling? No, absolutely not. If you insist on saying it, then okay, it's grammatically correct and I'm not going to stop you. But almost everybody will say who are you calling, okay? Sometimes you'll hear speakers using whom after a preposition, okay? You gave the book to whom? From whom did you receive that gift of an octopus? But again, do we say that? It's possible, but rare. Who did you give that book to? Much, much more common to remove the whom and just put a to at the end of the sentence. So let me get to the point. Yes, we still do use whom in everyday conversation in one situation, okay? And that is after quantifiers such as many, several, some of, both of, a number of. For example, I met 3 girls, 2 of whom were wearing hats. Many people came to the party, some of whom got really drunk. We had hundreds of candidates, a small number of whom had the right profile. Of course, in these sentences, you could use them instead of whom. But if you did that, you would have to make a new sentence. We had hundreds of candidates, full stop. Some of them had the right profile. It's correct, but sometimes you want to keep it in one sentence for the flow, okay? It just sounds more conversational and flowing, so it's just a question of style, okay? But as you can see, whom is used in conversation. Question words and relative pronouns. Now look at these sentences and tell me if they are correct or incorrect. I don't know. Who is that man? Are you sure you know what does he want? No, of course not. They are not correct. But I've heard these type of sentences so often. I'm sure I hear them every day as an English teacher. So the correct sentences are, I don't know who that man is. Are you sure you know what he wants? Now, the confusion lies in the words who, what, how, which, why, when, where. These are the words we use to form questions, but these words have two functions. Now, when we form questions in English, we use what we call inversion. All this means is that we swap the position of the subject and the verb so that the auxiliary or modal verb goes before the subject. You did that. To make the question, the subject goes before the verb, and of course you start the question with the question marker did. Did you do that? And we can add a how before that to get more information. How did you do that? How did you do that? I don't know. You are here. That's a statement. To make a question, we use inversion, so you put the verb before the subject. Are you here? We add a question word for more information. Why are you here? Now, these question words have a second function as relative pronouns. But when you use them as relative pronouns, you do not use inversion. And this is where the confusion lies. I do not know why you are here. No inversion. Never say, I do not know why are you here. Okay, that's not correct. So here's an exercise. Correct these sentences. Please explain, where did you put the coconuts? Not correct. No inversion, and you don't need the question marker did. Please explain where you put the coconuts. That's correct. I need to know, what should I do? Your turn. I need to know what I should do. So that's correct. I need to know what I should do. Easy, huh?